welcome to everyone who's joined us today. And I wanted to give a brief history of the Gwendolyn Carter Conference or lectures. It varies in format from year to year. Some years it's in the format that we're doing this year, which is a series of lectures. Other years it's a symposium or conference type event. It does vary by the person who's convening it. For the last 20 plus years, this has always been convened by a UF faculty member. I remember pretty vividly in, I think, 2004 when Joan did this. And despite the fact that it's 17 years ago, there's so many memories from that event still really etched in my mind. So it's great to have another one focused on dance.
Put the house light on.
No, put this one on.
Okay. So for those of you that haven't joined one of our webinars before, we will go about 45 minutes with our speaker today, after which we'll have another plus or minus 45 minutes for comments and Q&A. And then after 5 o'clock Eastern, if Dr. Adewole is willing, we will turn off the recording and you can hang out and chat more informally with her online, as long as she's willing to stay up, presuming that she's connecting from the UK today. So when we get to Q&A, if you want to comment or ask a question, please use the raise hand function. I will call on you in the order that I see those. And I will also at that point switch you over to be a panelist. So you will have the ability to switch on your video to ask your question or make your comment. That's up to you. This is being recorded. It may be uploaded to YouTube. So if you do switch on your video, you're giving consent for your image to be used in that fashion. So with all those details being said, I'm going to turn it over to one of our own here at University of Florida, Hajrat Ali from the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone that we're having 2 more sessions in this year's Carter. On October 22nd, we'll have Faustine Linyakula from Studios Kabako in the Democratic Republic of Congo will be joining us. And then on November 12th, we'll have Kudus Onikeku from Q Dance Center in Lagos, and also here at the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Florida. So I think I've done my job. I'm going to turn it over to you, Hajrat, for introducing our speaker today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Todd. First of all, I'd like to say it's an honor to introduce Dr. Adewole. I have heard a lot about her, and when Joan asked me to do this, I was really, really happy. So Dr. Adewole is a lecturer in dance at the School of Humanities and Performing Arts. She started out as a media practitioner in Nigeria and moved into performance on relocating to England in 1994. For several years, she toured with physical, visual, theater, and African dance drama companies. Her credits include performances with Ritual Arts, Horse and Bamboo Mask, and Puppetry Company. Artist in Exile at Zido Pan-African Dance Ensemble, Mushango African Dance and Music Company, and the Chomondeles Contemporary Dance Company. She chaired the Association of Dance of the African Diaspora in Britain, ADAD, from 2005 to 2007. In this role, she initiated and directed the ADAD Heritage Project, which contributed to the documentation of Black-led dance companies and choreographers in England, that is between 1930s and 1990s. She also completed a PhD in dance studies at the Montfort University in Leicester in 2017. For 25 years of tireless work to change perceptions of dance of the African diaspora, Dr. Adewole was honored with the Dance of the African Diaspora Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019. I hope I did justice to that introduction. So I guess I'll pass it to Dr. Adewole now. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you, welcome. Thank you very much. Thanks for that lovely welcome. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Joan, for inviting me. It's so exciting to be here. I have great memories of Gainesville when I was there about 17 years ago for Movement Revolution Africa. And that was a moment, I would say, within the history of contemporary African dance. And I would say in the performance of dance on the continent, because that event captured a very important story. And so I'm going to be talking today about contemporary dance as African cultural production. So why have I chosen that topic, contemporary dance as African cultural production? I've chosen that because I want to talk about story. You know, one of the things I do is tell stories. And stories are very powerful things because they introduce a perspective. Stories are powerful, they have their limitation. No story encapsulates everything that took place in the event. It never does. A storyteller is selective, a historian is selective. They take particular issues that relate to the point they want to make or to the issue they're investigating. And therefore, when you create a story, you create a world. You create a world that people can come into and investigate. They can investigate the characters in that story, the relationships between them, what they're going to do, and speculate about how they're going to go forward, or even why the story ended up that way. And so when we talk about histories and stories, we're not talking about complete things, but we are creating a narrative in which we can investigate things we're interested in. And that's, again, a reason why stories and histories are revised. You know, if you look upon your stages, if you've learned a particular history of dance, for example, and then you look upon your stages and you see performances that don't exist in your history, you go back to the history and say, what happened that led to this performance that we haven't yet recorded? And then you might record that, you might revise the history again in order to find out what led to the place you are in. And so perspective is very important to storytelling. You know, over the years, different forms of stories, different incidents are returned to find out the perspectives of people that have been left out. You know, usually when we talk about the history of a country, for example, we talk about it from the point of view of the rulers. What did the president do? What did the councillors think? What did the senators have to say about this? And some historians have come back to, you know, political histories and said, no, what were the people on the ground doing? What were the women in the factories doing during the Second World War? What were the local people doing during the demonstrations, during the voting, for example? What were they doing? What was their perspective? And then we get another story, and we see that history is actually a weaving of different stories together. And in order to find out certain things, we have to look at the story from a particular perspective and look at the story from the perspective of particular characters in that story. And therefore, I say it's important that we look at contemporary dance as African cultural production because it gives us a particular perspective. And without that perspective, we lose the power of the form. There's a lot of debate within African performance over the definition of what we do. What is contemporary dance? Is contemporary dance African? How do we define it from an African perspective? But my argument is that a definition without a discourse is not very powerful because definitions come out of discourse. So if I pin a discourse on something without a story to show how that that definition emerged, it's not a powerful discourse. You don't have power in the cultural field to really define yourself that way. It's easy for someone to erase that definition. Definitions that have power come out of conversations between institutions, conversations between artists. And so if we look at contemporary dance in Africa, what's the story? What's the discourse? Where did it emerge from? Which institutions were in collaboration and discussion over this? And then our definition has power. Furthermore, such definitions can evolve without people thinking, hey, hold on, you said this was contemporary dance today. Now you're describing something else as contemporary dance. You see, when I was growing up in Nigeria, we used to call dance drama contemporary dance. We used the word modern dance. It was modern dance because it was created for the stage. Now people might look at that practice and say, it's traditional. So the idea of evolution only comes when we have a story behind what we're defining. And one of the problems, I would say it is a problem within African performance, is the lack of documentations of those stories from the points of view of the people taking part. There was one critic who said one of the problems of African studies is that we're often writing and investigating issues to speak back to the West. So you will find that we might define things because we're speaking back to Africa, we're speaking back to the West, and we're speaking back to dominant discourses. And so in contemporary African dance, a lot of the debates revolve around issues of aesthetics. People look at the production and say, is that African enough or not? People might argue and justify their choreography based on the fact that things in traditional culture evolve. And since culture evolves on a day-to-day basis, then their choreography too has a right to evolve. So they look for equivalences to justify what they're doing on stage. However, I would argue that there's a better way of defining what contemporary African dance is, of placing it within an African story. And I would say we should go back to the development of dance as a profession in Africa. How did dance grow and develop as a profession? And so I will pick a moment within time. We go back to independence. And in around the 1950s and 60s, there began to be festivals in Africa where traditional dances were staged. And dances were staged as part of a cultural revival, as part of an independence movement. And this was a very exciting time within Africa. And it was at this time, I would say, the idea of dance as a profession began to emerge. A number of companies opened up national dance companies. And the first one was Les Ballets Africains de Guinée. And then we started seeing dancers becoming civil servants. Also, there was a promotion by many countries to use dance as tourism. And so it was possible to earn some money, not necessarily a whole livelihood, from performance. And so also this idea that you could perform dances and people could pay you started changing people's attitude to culture. People from the rural areas could come to the cities and perform, for example. And also there were auditions held by arts councils that were set up. So what do we find happening in post-independent Africa, we found things emerging like the dancer as a professional. The idea of the Arts Council started coming up. Dance companies started to emerge. The idea of a dance troupe or a cultural troupe. And so a new ecology of institutions began to emerge and arrive. And with this, we started seeing a context for dance as an artistic practice, which was different from how people performed in ritual or social context or in ceremony. I would say a parallel practice started to develop. For example, there's many stories of people who were based in villages in Nigeria who would come down to the National Theatre and perform, and then they would go and perform back in a traditional festival. And so they wouldn't do exactly what they do in the traditional festival on stage. And these parallel practices started to emerge. And the idea of a dance company, dance troupe, the idea of touring in this way started to emerge within dance. We might say this is where the story starts. Can you imagine? For me, it was a very powerful thing. I was born in Britain, and my parents moved back to Nigeria in 1977. And in 1977, there was an enormous festival in Nigeria, which was Pan-African, and it was called Festac 77. And I remember as a little girl, I was under the age of 10 then, just watching on television all these dances. I believe that festival had such a strong impact on me. It's one of the reasons why I went into the performing arts. And Festac and other festivals of that nature started to create links between performers within Africa and within the diaspora. It started to create situations where artists would go abroad and stay there and start working as independent artists. And this, I think, hasn't really been looked at enough. I'm sure the history I'm telling you now is not, is not strange to a lot of you listening. However, because we've argued so much as to the arguments and the debates around this development has mainly been, is it legitimate? Is it right? Is it really African dance when it goes on stage? And this was most of the debates around the idea of neo-traditional dance. Should we be doing it? And then a role was assigned to it. The role of neo-traditional dance is to preserve culture. But because of these debates, there hasn't been enough engagement with what people actually do within the dance company or what people actually did within those dance companies. I have only come across one book when I was in Nigeria, and I left Nigeria in the 90s, which was called The Rudiments of African Choreography, in which the author wrote about how he choreographed and how he choreographed traditional dance for stage. And many methodologies of choreographing traditional dance were formed. However, not many of them were documented. In fact, it was even considered a necessary evil to choreograph. You should hide your creativity because if you showed it, it might mean your work is not genuine. However, when we look back, we see this is where dance as a profession really emerged. And I would say that now is the time that we should start thinking about a sociology of art when looking at that era. We often look at neo-traditional dance with an anthropological lens. But if we look at the fact that the artists working in this genre were developing new contexts for work, new art, a new art world, actually, then maybe a sociology of art is a better way of examining what was happening at that time. And if we look at what was developing there, we begin to see that this is the context in which we can begin to understand contemporary dance in Africa as African cultural production. Why? I would say the discipline African cultural production is a discipline which focuses a lot on cultural forms developed within a business context, within a subsidized context, like within theatre for development, and within commercial contexts. And within the subject, the discipline of African cultural production, people are looking at generating critical contexts for work created within cultural business. And I would say the artistic practice that has been focused on the most, especially in West Africa, is the film industry. I think the most famous being Nollywood, this straight to video cassette industry that began to emerge in the 90s. Actually, if I'd stayed back in Nigeria, I left in 1994, if I'd stayed back, I'd probably have gone into Nollywood, because I was a TV producer when I left. And in the early 90s, the Nigerian government allowed private operators to start. So up until, I think, 1993, you had to be, only the government could establish a TV station. And then in the early 90s, the government gave people licenses to open up TV stations. And I was just graduating in 1990, and I got a job as a TV producer. And then Nollywood was starting. People started creating movies, you know, in their backyards, in their living rooms, straight to VHS, because at this time you could you could go out and rent, you know, VHS videotapes and watch films at home. And this industry, the Nollywood film industry, has been researched quite strongly. But this whole change in the 90s, when a lot of African countries had taken IMF loans and had the World Bank giving them directives on how they had to organize their economy, caused a lot of home industries to start developing. I remember at that time, there was a lot of restructuring happening in different countries in West Africa, and in Nigeria, a lot of people were retrenched from civil service. And my mother, that used to work in the Nigerian Television Authority, was one of the people that were retrenched. And there was great change. And she actually, she also started a small industry of making soap for a period of time before she decided she didn't want to do that anymore. And in this period, this is when the dance competition, which was sponsored by the French, began. And so if I was to look at this happening from the point of view of African cultural producers, it was part, from their point of view, part of trying to enter into international markets. And so, you know, the story of contemporary African dance comes out of the development of dance and performance as an independent practice within Africa. A lot of the national dance companies coming into the 80s and into the 90s were losing government funding. Government stopped funding them. And Nigerian's national dance company, less people were full-time artists and more people became freelance and self-employed. And so there was a push. I mean, people have made fun of artists, some of the artists that went into contemporary dance at this time. And some people have called what they did passport dance, the dance you do to get a passport to get out of the continent. I remember Zag Mabunga actually talking about that at Movement Revolution back then. But there's different ways of looking at this particular story. There's an article I read about the emergence of contemporary dance in Africa by a writer called Alter Desprez. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly, it's French. And her argument was that this competition started contemporary dance in Africa. That before that, there was no contemporary dance. She mentioned the fact that there were competitions and festivals like I have spoken about, like Festac 1977. And even before that, in the 60s, there were national dance festivals all over the continent. In the first one in Nigeria was in 1965. She mentions that, but she argues that those competitions focused on heritage. She also mentions pioneers like Jamina Konyi, Alphonse Tireux, but she says what they did was small scale. And therefore, it was when the competition started that contemporary dance really took off. Now, my perspective of this is that I don't agree with that idea. Because contemporary dance, and then we used to call it modern dance, was really about developing a new idea about dance in terms of the institutions, the new institutions that were emerging, and in terms of the new international terrain that dance artists, African dance artists were entering. When the national dance companies, which were touring Africa and touring the world in the 60s, 70s, 80s, went on these tours, artists would stop off in different countries and they would collaborate with people in Europe, America, as far as Australia. And so there was already an international scene of artists working between Africa and Europe and other countries in the world. Also, there were artists in universities making work. So the idea of modernity on creating a modern dance was there. And people were thinking very much in terms of form. People thinking a modern African dance, what would that be? That it was small scale is not an issue. At the time, modern dance was small scale everywhere. In America, the pioneers like Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey, they were all small scale. And they would have remained small scale if they hadn't got large grants from the government, especially Martha Graham, which took her worldwide. Modern dance, the Graham technique particularly, would have been small scale in Britain if Robin Howard hadn't decided to put lots of money into it and build a school around it, London Contemporary Dance. It is the change in perspective that marked the beginning of the practice. What the competition did, however, from my perspective, is create a dance industry. And it did bring African dance, contemporary African dance artists into an international sphere. So, however, unless there had been that collaboration with the African diaspora, both in Europe and it was mainly Europe then, and then later America. Again, the contemporary dance scene wouldn't have existed. So when you look at what I did once was look at a list of the participants for the first competition. And I found out that none of them were novices. All of them were either trained dancers with national dance companies, and a few of them had even gone abroad and trained in America in contemporary dance form or modern dance forms and come back. And the dancers from South Africa had had years of training in a variety of forms. And the competition galvanized this. The prayer points out something very important, and she points out the kind of rules that the French funders and competition organizers placed on the participants. For example, they said, if you wanted to show work in the competition, the work should show markers of Africa, so signifiers in the movement that suggested it was African, but shouldn't indicate any Pacific ethnicity. She also points out that the participants their work should be transgressive and therefore show elements of French avant-gardeness. And she tells the story of a particular artist that applied to go into the competition and wanted to do something which, from the description, was dance drama. And I know that dance drama was considered to be modern dance in the 1980s and up into the 90s in certain places. And the official he met at the competition just refused that he should present this work. And in the end, he produced something which was, arrhythmical, in which he was speaking Arabic and throwing water at the audience, and looked like an African version of French modern dance. So from the perspective of the writer, this proved that contemporary dance was a form produced for French audiences and to revitalize dance in Europe. It's very true that this kind of work was developed. And it's very true that from the point of view of certain promoters and producers and funders, that is what they were doing when they came into Africa and when they got involved with African performance. However, when we look at the winners of these competitions, and when we look at what they have done since, we find it's not the artists that were developed in that way that are running the show now. The artists running the show now are those that had, on the whole, a quite in-depth training within traditional forms or had trained in dance schools, either in the continent or outside the continent. And so what has gone forward from that competition, the peoples whose careers were launched by the competition and have sustained it since, which run dance festivals in different parts of the continent today and who are touring. One of them, who is Faustin Lignécula, who will be with us in this series, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. He was one of the winners. They are not people that were developed in that way. They are people that had a philosophy behind what they do and a vision for dance. And so whilst there was a mixed bag of different kinds of performers coming out of the competition, those that actually have developed schools and projects and a performance career are those that dug deep and had a vision for their practice. One of the ways I think of dancers in contemporary dance, or dancers in generally who work within theatrical practice in Africa, I consider them to be investigators of the terrain. And that terrain is the terrain of post-independent Africa. Because when you look at the work of choreographers, you see people whose work has actually developed a new kind of ecosystem. And so, if we're going to speak of the story of contemporary dance, we shouldn't just speak about the aesthetics. We should think about what their work has produced in terms of social practices, institutions, and they've created new social spaces and developed new methodologies that work, new creative methodologies that work in those social spaces. When you look at the negotiations that a choreographer does, you know, they link different kinds of institutions together. Some people, their work links together, you know, rural activities, some people, religious activities with the stage. Contemporary dance in Africa, but you know, there's different types, not all, comes out of a terrain that does not exist in Europe. When I look even at the folk dance company in Europe and the folk dance company, or what's called the folk dance company in Africa, they come out of a completely different kind of circumstances, and they're sustained by a different kind of ecology. Our story of dance in Africa as a theatrical practice has to be embedded within this social cultural context. Otherwise, we're only talking about aesthetics, and this definition of contemporary African dance is too shallow to tell us what is being produced. Contemporary dance artists are producers of knowledge. They produce training systems, knowledge about the body. They produce imaginations of the future. And we can only understand this in depth if we look at how they've impacted the terrain around them. So we often think of, and we've often debated about, the higher institution in Africa as being colonized. And people are calling for the decolonization of academic knowledge within Africa. And I would argue that the colonial discourse is one that diverts our attention always to speaking back to the West, to speaking back to Europe, or speaking back to the white race. That focus is a colonial focus. That discourse is a colonial discourse because it stops us from actually looking at what we're producing and the problems we're solving and the ideas we're producing for now. It stops us from actually creating histories, contemporary histories of practice. When I say contemporary histories of practice, I mean post-independent. That way of thinking makes us put value only on pre-colonial Africa, and anything post-colonial Africa is considered not really African. And so we throw away so much. There is a proverb. Some people say it's Kenyan, some people say it's Zimbabwe, some people say it's Nigerian, Igbo to be exact. And the proverb is, until the lions tell their story, history will only glorify the hunter. And so we need to tell the story, not simply to say, we have a story too, and we have history too. We can't produce knowledge and look in depth at what we're creating and the story of what we're doing as investigators of that terrain.
Thanks, Funmi. You broke up for just a few seconds there at the end, but I'm taking it that you're now finished and we can go to Q&A. So I'm looking for raised hands in the room if someone has a question or comment. Okay, I'm seeing a hand.
Hello,
Joan, do you want to
Joan.
go first?
I
You have the honor, Joan, if you would like to ask the first question.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank you so much, Funmi. This is just such an important moment for all of us. Number one, big welcome back to the University of Florida. You're a beloved entity here. You made an enormous splash with us with Movement Revolution. We changed so many things with that conference moving forward into the field. And I think this is we're at this moment again. So it just gives me chicken skin to hear all that you've said, because I think what you're calling for is in fact something that really then begins to honor, as you say, the terrain, the investigation, rather than the speaking against only, to really truly look. And I just want to mention in that I don't believe that we can see all of the participants that are here, or maybe we can, I'm not so sure. Is that possible, Todd, to see?
There's about 35 people in the room.
Right, we've got, yeah, I think 39 in the room, but I'm just going to mention, I don't know if they're here or not. But for one example, people like Lassina Coulibaly, if he's present, that's great.
He was, I'm not sure if he's still here, but yeah, he's here.
Okay, who has reinvented a pedagogy completely sort of drawn from his understanding of the production of knowledge within the setting, within his terrain, coming from southern Burkina Faso. Anani Anuvi is here also. And
correct, yes.
When you had talked about Europe sort of almost taking, if you will, to renew European dance. You know, there's so many examples of that. And we, you know, Anani had the experience where he was selected as a Rolex prize winner, whereby Anna Teresa de Keersmacher, quote unquote, got to train him. And his stories around that tell us so much about that tension between defining oneself, you know, against the colonial, you know, impulse, and then truly just being who one is from the investigation that one is doing firsthand. So I just absolutely applaud you, because the speaking against is in some sense a reiteration of the colonial practice. In other words, that still is the center. And I think that it's an extraordinarily important point that you're making, or that I'm hearing, if I'm correct in how I'm hearing you, is that we're literally shifting center, which then is, you know, Achille Mbembe asking us to see that the center of the world is shifting, that we cannot any longer just do the comparison. So I guess, where have you, in all of this, I mean, are you reading, are you seeing artists that you are feeling that are making this point very, very strongly, or other scholars that are bringing this forth in a way that you'd like to call out for us to consider? We'd love to learn from you on that.
Well, thank you. I tend to focus on how people use language. I'm very into the discourses that develop around people's work. And so the move of people, of choreographers, to start calling what they're doing a practice is something that's really caught my ear. And they start talking about their choreographic practice or their dance practice and choosing very specific things to investigate. And the two artists that you have coming up, Faustin, who's known, you know, in terms of how he talks about his aesthetics, how he talks about his body being the last, you know, the last place where, you know, he can seek refuge, and talking about the aesthetics of waste. You know, the way he speaks, he does use a lot of traditional social forms in his work, like Ndombolo, for example. But the way he speaks about the work with and what his work addresses makes us really look at it through a particular lens. We look at it in terms of, you know, we look at it in terms of the difficulties of African politics. He doesn't try and justify his choreography based on is it traditional enough or not traditional enough. He stands as a contemporary or present day African man and has created a practice in which he addresses, you know, addresses the traumas and the difficulties and makes space for the traumas and the difficulties within a public sphere. And for me, contemporary dance is very much about that. It's very much about artists taking the public sphere, the public space, in order to create new modes of, new practices of representation, new practices of that have in symbolism and codes and can speak to us, you know, through the body, not just through words, but through the body and through imagery. And really taking it beyond looking at it as a mode of preserving culture. And I also want to add that some artists, they see their role as preserving culture, and that is fine. But this assigned thing, there's only one thing a choreographer should do, and that is to preserve culture. That I find problematic. So some of the artists that I see emerging is Nadia Bourget. She's not new. She was from Company Cheche, and I saw her work in Germany, and she's really emerging, and she's really emerged really as a solo artist. In Britain, we have Alexandra Souten, who is Zimbabwean and Belgium, and a very strong soloist in her own right. I really enjoy the work that she's producing as well. And I met recently some dancers from Burundi, Josh and Congo. They're very new on the scene, but they're emerging after a lot of political trauma in Burundi, and they've set up a collective of Theatre Burundi. That's what they call themselves. And I met them in Senegal very recently. And so what I'm finding, because I tend to look at, I suppose, lesser individuals, but how people are moving in collectives and groups, I'm finding that in Africa right now, people are really owning dance as part of the creative economy. And I think that artists are going down that road because that's where they can take ownership of the work and direct how it's developing. So I noticed recently that the dancers in Nigeria have moved from calling themselves the Guild of Nigerian Dancers to the Guild of Nigerian Dance Practitioners. And I think that's significant. And at the end of August, I also was invited to speak at a a conference in Ivory Coast online. I was online. I wasn't able to go to Ivory Coast. And the artists there have created an association in order to strengthen their position within the cultural industries there. So those are the sort of things that I'm noticing in the industry. But I'm also noticing that artists are also linking their work to other contemporary fields. So some people linking their work to literature, what African writers have done in literature, and some people looking at African philosophy. I think it was Serge Coulibaly that did a production recently looking at the life of Fela Nicolas Bokuti. So people looking at contemporary icons. And I think that's important. There's a producer, her name is Joyce Mboya, and she's Kenyan. And she wrote an article saying, "Let us watch dance." And in that article, what she was saying was that previously, people would look at dance on stage and compare it to what they have experienced within the social realm and their social day-to-day lives. But now she was encouraging people to look at dance and see it in terms of how does it relate to cinema? How is it relating to visual arts? How is it relating to even video games? The reason is that the visual culture in Africa has really changed and developed, and people are acknowledging this. Now, what I don't want to do is just say it's all about art, it's all about African artists doing new things. It's more than that. It's really them developing a philosophy of understanding this newness and creating a narrative for it. Otherwise, what we do is just if we have this nostalgic attitude, we just live fractured. And so what they're doing is actually creating a narrative and a philosophy. So we can start looking at our present day Africa in a philosophical sense, and not only from this position of loss, but also from the position of the fact that we have agency and we can recreate. And I think it's so important because we in Africa have absorbed, adopted, and adapted Western institutions. We've taken over the idea of the federal government, the idea of parliamentary systems, civil services, civil society, but we're not running them, and we cannot run them, and we shouldn't run them the way they're run in Europe. That doesn't mean we don't run them well, but we have a completely new history. How do we think through that history? And it's artists, I think, like Kudus, who's really taking those kind of things on board. You know, taking those kind of things on board and thinking about them and saying provocative things, both in movement and voice. And it's so you know, Greg McCormack. I was just recently watching a documentary of his online where he is talking about very much addressing contemporary South African life and politics and what it means to be an African now in his work. And so, yes, I'm sort of looking at I'm mentioning these individuals, but I'm just sort of seeing a sort of movement across contemporary artists where they are creating a new narrative for their work, a philosophy for their work, which before was only accorded to novelists and playwrights and visual artists. And I'm happy now that dance has stopped being the art form that gives playwrights, authenticates the work of playwrights, but also stands on its own as an art form in its own right. I hope I answered some of what you wanted, Joan. I just went off.
Yes, and phenomenally so. Thank you so much, Funmi. I'll leave the floor to somebody else to ask a question.
Okay, we have a question or comment from Eric. Eric, go ahead. You have the ability to turn on your sound and video.
Here I am. Good evening. My name is Eric Murianki. I'm from Kenya and I'm at UF right now. I really want to commend the good job that you've done in terms of trying to give a perspective of a dance or dances that or things that happen in dance in Africa. And mine is just a thought. I've been reading a few things about, now the reason why I am actually speaking is because sometimes it's very hard to separate music, to separate dance from song. The Western perspective of it is that it's music. From when you view it from outside of Africa, it's music. But we know that we cannot separate both dance from song. I mean, they happen at the same time. And that is why I am thinking that culture or music, for example, what am I going to, the notion of African dance or African music is from a person who is outside Africa viewing at Africa. But we from Africa have a different way of looking at it, because I like the way you said that a lot of things, a lot of artistic things suffers lack of documentation, okay? And so mine is just a thought that in your own way of telling the story, are you able to say specifically, maybe this is dance from maybe Nigeria, dance from Kenya, dance from maybe any other part of Africa? Because when you say African, then the viewers or the listeners listening from outside will see it as a whole African thing from south to north. And that is why maybe most of the things that we've done in Africa are not out there, or people misinterpret a lot of artistic things because they are generalized. They are generalized that when you see someone dancing this way, he's from Africa. But Africa is a huge continent with a lot of countries, a lot of nations, and every nation has their unique characteristics of that. Maybe we have you and other scholars maybe who are passionate about African art. I'm saying African so that everyone understands what I'm talking about, but arts from African nations, so that they get to know that there is a lot to be said, a lot to be researched, and things are changing. Art is dynamic, and as kind of it's changing from what it was to something new. So we are the scholars, you are the scholar that is going to change the narrative from African to specifics, to specific cultures in African nations. Come, think of a word that will represent specific thing from it's just a thought. It's a line to think.
We often, I mean, Eric, you brought up something that we talk about a lot, you know, somebody, you know, there's an organization, for example, called Africa is Not a Country. And we're a continent, you know, there's over 50 nations. And even in my country, you know, we argue there's about 280 languages and each culture has its own way of dancing. I completely agree. But I'm going to play devil's advocate. I don't actually think that is the big problem we're facing. I think the big problem we're facing, because we do say European art, we do use those big general terms as well. The thing is the way we organize our knowledge. if someone talks to me about European dance theatre, for example, I sort of know the genres of dance that they're talking about that come under that. With African performance, the way we've conceptualized our knowledge, when we say African, I mean, when you look at the first dance companies and people were calling their work African, like Les Ballets Africains de Guinea, you know, or Opoku wrote, you know, he used to call him, said, even Niate, who passed away in 2015, he wrote a book called Transformations of African Dance in Ghana. They're not talking about Africa just as the continent, but as a way of thinking. They're talking about it philosophically, almost like Pan-Africanism. And I find it dangerous if we say, okay, Africa has many cultures, it has many nations, and therefore we have to be Pacific. Which choreographer do you know is only doing the dance of one place? Most people are mixing dances together. Most people are deconstructing dance forms. We cannot use a theory that has come out of anthropology to look at theater. We will never get anywhere with that because that's not what is going on. It's better, you know, some choreographers specialize in a group of forms. They might say, I work within Yoruba dance. I'm Yoruba, but there's more than one dance in Yoruba, in Yoruba dance. And then some choreographers, they're looking at certain principles in the Yoruba dance, not even the whole dance are they using. They might just be using 2 or 3 principles and using those principles in several ways because they've created a choreographic practice from it. And if we insist that that what we are doing on stage, we have to use a terminology. I know we are trying to give the work value by saying, talking about its culture, but actually, the culture of the theatre is a different culture it's related, but it's not the same. So what are we doing in the theatre? We are creating something that we are drawing on our traditional forms or our social dance forms, and we're creating a practice that is for us to see, we're creating a theatre practice. I think playwrights have it easy. They have it easy because they're writing a text and they write a story, and then we know if they've written a play. The reason why dance is such a controversial issue and creates so much debate is because everybody dances. And everybody dances, and people dance in social situations, ceremonial situations, they dance in ritual situations, and therefore we think theatre dance is the same as that. Theatre dance is its own context as well. In the 90s, I wanted to study theatre, and I wrote a letter to one of my former lecturers in University of Ibadan, and she wrote me a letter back, and I still have it, and she said, I'm really excited that you want to come back to Nigeria and study the sub-genre of theatre dance. So in at least up until the 90s, theatre dance was seen as a sub-genre of traditional dances. However, now it's becoming a genre in its own right. And it has its own practice, which relates to them, but it's not the same as them. And for me, traditional dance is defined from where you perform it. Because traditional dances are also modern, they evolve, they change. But if I go to the Ogun Festival, or go to a ceremony at the King's Palace, I will say that is traditional because they're using it for a traditional purpose. Even though they might bring new things in it, it's for traditional purpose. It's not static, but it remains for a traditional purpose. This is the way I look at it. Theatre, we are using it for audiences that come from all over the world. And then the last thing before I keep quiet is this idea of Africa. I want to return to it. When you look at discourses on Africa, you will find that diasporans, people from the diaspora, African America, the Caribbean, Afro-Peruvian, Colombian, they talk about Africa in a particular way. Africans talk about Africa in a different way. People from the Northern Hemisphere, they talk about Africa in different ways. We're not all talking about Africa the same way. And the only way we're going to get clarity, I believe, is if we start being clear about what context we're using these words and in relation to what. I don't think if we say we're going to define our theatre dance by the nation, we will get anywhere. We'll never write a book because it's impossible. It's impossible because choreographers are not working with forms in discrete ways. They are not. So that is my response.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Next question or comment is from Thomas. You should be able to enable your video and audio, Thomas. I've just sent you a prompt. Okay, give him a moment.
Is it working?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, well, see, when I wrote my question down was a while ago, so we've moved on, and I think you've answered actually most of it. But one question I think which still interests me is Toni Morrison mentioned that to her, several African writers, continental, were kind of essential or central in her, for her and her ability to find kind of that voice which did not speak over her shoulder, that allowed her kind of to, let's say, center herself and to be able to hit that mark on even her first book. And my question or my interest is kind of if you're seeing that exchange in Afropeans and African Americans and African Caribbeans, etc., who are trying now, maybe even more than before, to find that kind of central voice, that voice that you mentioned that doesn't necessarily speak back to the Euro-Western, but tries to, and I say try to because, you know, bound to fail in many cases, center themselves in a way that doesn't speak back to, but is kind of assuming the centrality of its own. Am I making sense?
Yes. I think when I do think of choreographers in the diaspora, I don't know any that come to mind that I feel are speaking to the West. They're not, when I say speaking to the West, I mean, well, there's many ways that one might speak to the West or not. I think because choreography itself as a practice, it itself has its own history, and we relate what we make to what other people have made before us, or making at the same time as us, and we do respond sometimes to what other people are making, or challenge or subvert. And I think that is okay. It becomes not okay. This is when I think it's not okay. When we start creating a narrative about what we're doing, which hides what we're doing because we want to talk back. And what I mean by talking back is this. if you define, I'm African, I'm therefore communal, dance is a communal thing. And because dance is a communal thing, I present the work and say, we made it as a group. However, if anyone came to the studio, they'll know that someone choreographed it and maybe it was very strongly led by one person. Why do we feel we need to define it in that way if it's not what we're actually doing? If we define it in that way, to whose benefit is it? Are we doing it to uphold this idea that I'm working just the way my ancestors did? Or are we defining it that way because we want to say, I am not European, Europeans work individually, I work as an African, I work as a group person? That is when I feel you're falling into a colonial discourse, because in order to be different from the West, you then define yourself away as different, or doing something completely different, but it's not actually what you're doing. The problem with that, and I've experienced this, is that you can't pass down what you're doing, because to pass it down means you have to explain that you're using choreographic methods, but you don't want to say you're using choreographic methods because they're Western. And therefore you don't say, and you don't really tell your dancers what you're doing, and no one really understands each other. And so you put your own self in a confusion. That's what I mean by talking back to the West. That's what I mean by revolving around the Western discourse, where you're doing everything to prove to the other that you're not that. Whereas there's a crossover because you're working in the same institutional context. There has to be. And if you do that, you can't document anything you're doing. So I know choreographers who have developed many choreographic practices and methods of creating work, but don't document them because they don't want to be seen as being Western, and the creator is Western. And that's what I'm actually that's what I'm actually referring to when I'm talking about talking back to the Western gaze, or falling into a colonial discourse. So you keep putting yourself into the past in order to avoid being considered to be Western, and then you get your self-worth or your justification as a choreographer based on being different from. Whereas even if you do create and do talk about your methodology, it will still be different from. So it's best to talk about it. So that's what I'm referring to.
Okay, Thomas, unless you have a follow-up, I'm going to let Michelle ask a question. Michelle, go ahead. You should be able to enable your audio and video. Okay, I can see you there, Michelle. There he comes.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hopefully. Thank you everybody for this opportunity. I have a really brief question because recently I was advising an emerging choreographer from Ivory Coast that didn't go to school. So, but is a really how can I place that? His work is really going against the norm of like expectations, and he was kind of conflicted since he was doing his MFA, I think MFA in France, and he has to write to the norms of what is expected from a master student. And my question is, what kind of a colonial language, what kind of effect the colonial language still bear on African choreographers till these days? in the creativity?
For me, it's when you don't have a story or you can't explain how you got to where you are, then usually you get a story imposed on you. Or the story you say of how you got to where you are is not accepted. Do you understand? And they say, no, 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 you're not that. And you get a story imposed on you. And therefore it becomes acceptable. It's only certain things you say is accepted. And I think that's what you're saying about your mentee, that he's in a program and it sounds like he's being asked to write about his work in a particular way.
Wait, yeah, exactly.
And the academy is a place which is about the production of knowledge. It's about a place about the production of knowledge of what we do, but the production of knowledge comes through a particular system, and it's usually a system of being able to speak about what you're doing through certain theories, in relation to certain existing discussions, and being able to evidence what you're saying in a particular way. And that can be very, very difficult if you're coming from your training and your career as a dancer is not supported by these things, because these things, if you've learned, for example, to dance in a dance company, how do you evidence this with books? It doesn't mean that you didn't do it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just that you don't have the kind of evidence they're asking for. And then if the supervisor looks upon what you're doing in a particular way, and they have people that have written about it from that perspective, then they can start imposing on you. And a lot of, I think my interest in academic work came from my experience in the industry, because I found that a lot of things, for example, we had a choreographer in Britain. He worked there for about 20 years. And I said to him, I was in a production that he choreographed, and he told me in this particular production that he created a war dance in which he merged two war dances together, one Zulu, South African, and one Ghanaian. And I said, this is amazing. I said, it looked like, when I saw the dance, it so went with the music that I wouldn't have known you fused it. He said, oh, because he worked with the musicians and created the music first. And then when he created the music, also from Zulu music and Ghanaian music, he then created the movements so that everything looks seamless. I said, oh my goodness, there's so much richness there and skill. Could we do a choreographic workshop on this? He said, oh, I'm not a choreographer. I said, why? He said, well, when he arrived in England, there was so much debate about whether he was a choreographer or not, because he was using traditional forms, and they kept on saying he's not doing choreography, he's doing reconstruction. And some people said he's doing restaging, or he's not choreographing, he's arranging. He decided to step out of the argument and call himself an artistic director. I said, okay, if you don't call yourself a choreographer, I can't actually raise funds. Mm. And he said, fine. And so he didn't teach anyone what he did. He knew. Do you see the problem there? So a dancer with a lot of experience can go into the academy, and because they don't have this discourse behind them, they can be dictated to on how to present their own work.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, he was accepted for for who he was from the beginning. So like he ends up like actually using like slangs from Ivory Coast called Nushi, and is tribal language, and combined that with like some French that he knows, and kind of like map it in the way that it can be seen, understood, and questioned. So that's what he did, and I find it like really interesting in a way that, you know, it left people imagination to his work, like to kind of like question their own perspective and how they see other stuff as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Michel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have another question or comment from Ibrahim Mjai.
Hey.
Ibrahim, are you there? Here he comes.
Hello. Hey, what up, Bug? Hello, Funmi.
How are you?
Long time no see, sister.
Long time, eh?
Yeah, I'm in Philadelphia in the University of Art doing my MFA in dance.
Yeah.
And saying hi to John and everybody in Gainesville. And thank you for this opportunity and this incredible lecture and things that you said. It's such a pleasure because especially right now in where we are in our career and time and space, there is a lot of questioning about and wonderment about what is the imaginary space, the African imaginary space. When I say that, I would like to ask, I wonder if it's important to ask ourselves if why we are wrong to use English or French or Portuguese, which are called the master's language. Is it that much important nowadays, as we know that it allowed us to communicate among us? Like, I speak French, Michel speak French, Anani speak French. So we're using the master, the colonizer language to be able to communicate between us and exchange. So I feel like the French or the English is now our language more than the master. So I will not worry about all those patrimony that we get from the colonizer because we use the master's tool to build our own house. But can we use the master tool to build our own language? That's where I'm wondering, because I know with everything that you guys share, there is a space for imaginary, there is a space for economic, there's a place for all these things that we're seeking for. So can you tell me more about, like, how can we bring the rural imaginary space into this academic way of teaching? Because we know that most of African dance form are from the countryside, the village. And because of the mondialization, and good that you mentioned the Ballet des Africains Noirs, and after the independence, if I take the example of Senegal, is after the Festival des Arts Nègres that Senegalese professional dance start to exist.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we defend something that is so young and there is a lot of gap and lack of information, archive? And the only way to have an imaginary contemporary space is to go back to this rural space. And what is the relation from this rural imaginary space and the urban imaginary space? Not to keep it too long, I'm just use the example of Coupe Décalé or Kuduru or all this Adonto. You can know that this is from urban dance imaginary space, but the the fundamental or the essence of the step is rural or is traditional.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and hi to everybody.
Hey, some hard questions, Kaulak, you know. I think what I would say is that an artist would have to develop and decide on themselves what they want their work to be about. There's no one person that can encapsulate the whole of Africa or even their village, I think. But you might have a particular thing you're interested in investigating or exploring or talking about in your work. And that is what I think is best for you to focus on and express. I think the difference, we have the rural space and we have the urban space. And as you said, the urban dances at their base, there's a lot of rural movement from the rural space into them. And then you see how the context changes, how the context demands how you use the dance. So dances usually transform, or our way of dancing usually transforms, or we develop a practice, because I wouldn't say everything transforms, because if I go to Nigeria, I won't dance. If I go home to my village, for example, I won't dance there the way I dance in Lagos, because they will just say, what's this? Because you have to be sensitive to the people around you, the participants, or you're not communicating with them. The same thing if you take the dance to Lagos, which is just 2 hours away from 3 hours from my city, I would dance in a different way there in order to participate and for people to connect with me. If I take it on stage, where the audience can come from different places, it becomes a different language there again. I use it in a different way there. So it depends where you're performing, and also what's your particular message, And you said something which I think is interesting. You said those languages, English, French, Portuguese, they were the master's languages, but now you would say they're your languages. And this was an argument that African writers were making in the 50s and 60s. And Chinua Achebe, who wrote The Things Fall Apart, he is famous for saying that he can make English bear the burden of his local, of his own indigenous language. So he used to write a lot of Igbo proverbs in English. No Englishman would use English in that way. Do you see what I mean? So you can use these things if you feel you want to use it to communicate your ideas in your way. I would say, for example, I would say all the institutions, the Western institutions in Africa, we use them in our way, to solve our problems and to communicate our messages and to create our communities. You can take it into the transnational situation and use it. Why? Because when you become a contemporary dancer, you're dealing with the public sphere. You're dealing with the public sphere. And contemporary dance is powerful for that. If I'm dancing in a nightclub, journalists don't come to look at me in a nightclub. Students don't really study what I do in a nightclub, but if I bring it to stage, this is the place where education is focused, where the media is focused, where you can critique what's happening in government. It's usually within the theatrical space, sometimes the popular space as well, but the theatrical space. And therefore, if you want to make the impact, you won't speak there the way you speak in the village, not because the village is less important, but they speak in a different way. and no one in the public space will understand you. I mean, if I stood here and I spoke, you know, me and my brother have a secret language. If I spoke the secret language I speak with my little brother here, no one will get me. So what's the point? What am I proving? Do you see what I mean? If I want to impact, then I will shape what I will say to make the impact, you know? And I would like to add that when most artistic movements that make a lot of impact tend to have some people that write about them as well. So even in Britain, when there was this new dance movement in the 1970s, they opened their own magazine and they wrote about, because the newspapers didn't want to review them, the journalists weren't interested, they wrote about their own work. Now, that movement is established in the archive. Lots of students are writing about it. So we have to, because we're dealing with the public sphere, we're dealing with institutions, the aim of our work is to impact all these institutions, education, the media, the internet, whatever. I think you do need people to write. If not yourself, get other people to write about your work. Yeah. I hope that answers some of what you brought up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And God bless you. My ancestors be with you and everybody. Thank you, John Rush.
Thank you, Ibrahima.
Yes.
Well, we've reached the end of our formal part of today's session. I'll remind you again that we've got 2 more sessions in this series coming up in the coming few weeks.